privacy rule, which is probably what you're most familiar with. One piece is the security rule, which is the stuff that the physicians and Dr. Lailfair really handle in terms of making sure that all the protected health information is handled in a secure manner in terms of what needs to get done. One area that we're going to talk about is the breach notification rule, which is really, really important. It's a relatively new issue, but when something goes wrong, what do we as a practice have to do in terms of helping to fix that? And then we'll talk about the things that each of you need to be aware of in terms of your daily functions, in terms of working through things. So this is the basic overview of the statute. It's actually a small piece. Some of you might remember, if you're old enough, back in '96, when they passed a law about health insurance portability. So when you switch from job to job, making sure you had coverage in place. One of the things that they put on the back end of this was this HIPAA thing, where they wanted to say, how do we simplify the healthcare system? And I know that sounds like a bit like an oxymoron in terms of the things that have happened over the past 20 years and the complexities, but they seem to think they have the best of intentions when they put it together. A few years back, they put them together as more and more people were using electronic health records. They put together rules about these breach notifications and then some regulations after that in terms of what happened. So the basic premise is, if you go back to Government 101, Congress passes the law, the president signs the law, and then because there's gaps in the law, they say, hey, regulatory agency, in this case, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, help us put policies together so we can interpret what we really meant when we passed that law, but we couldn't really address it in the law. So there's a whole bunch of what they call regulations that address all these issues in terms of what has to happen. Here's the key standards again that we're going to walk through: the privacy, security, breach, and like anything, because it's a federal government program, there are penalties for non-compliance, and there are regular penalties that come out that affect all different types and shapes and sizes of providers for things that may not have gone as smoothly as they'd like. All right, the privacy rule. National standards, you all have probably heard, if you've worked in the medical field for even a little bit of time, PHI, or protected health information. That's the foundation of the things that we need to think about. It applies to what's called covered entities. Jersey Urology Group is what they call a covered entity. If you go to the supermarket's not a covered entity unless their pharmacy might be part of a covered entity. But if you're shopping in the produce aisle, they're not a covered entity, so the rules that they have to abide by are very different than the rules we need to abide by in terms of what we do. Protected health information, it's a little bit of a longer definition, but that's really the key. It's things that there's a reasonable basis to figure out who they are. So if there's some way you can connect who Bruce Armin is, it's likely going to be PHI. And there's a more formal definition in the regulation where they have a whole number of different criterion: age, birth date, address, date of admit, date of discharge, a whole bunch of different things that the government has determined. If you have this information in here, we can identify who this person is. And the important thing about it, you can see it's in any form or medium. So it doesn't only have to be electronic. Paper files still abide by that in terms of the requirements in terms of what's considered to be protected health information. Here's some of the examples from some of the things I talked about before. It's only a small subset of the examples. There's a lot of different pieces to it in terms of what's considered PHI. The important thing, as I said, and this will be a constant theme, if you're not sure if something's protected health information and therefore covered by HIPAA, ask the privacy officer, ask one of the doctors, so you make sure. It's always better to ask a question than doing something and say, oh, I should have asked Dr. So-and-so about this, because once the genie's out of the bottle, it's hard to put it back in terms of what you've done. So if you have a question about something, please make sure you ask one of the physicians or ask the privacy officer about what needs to get done. So we start with protected health information, which is the smaller subset. The larger subset is what's the thing called health information. Health information has a very broad definition, as you can see from this. It's basically past, present, or future physical or mental health are all the things that are included. Then the subset of that becomes the protected health information in terms of what the rule is. So you say, well, great, why does this matter to me, and why am I listening to this on a Friday afternoon? The privacy rule applies to what we call covered entities. There's three main types of covered entities that have to, be governed by what the privacy rule are. Healthcare providers, JUG, is a healthcare provider. We have to abide by what the HIPAA rules say. Health plans, Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield, they have rules as well in terms of what they need to do. Then there's this other sort of strange entity called healthcare clearinghouses. that move information back and forth from one party to another, they're also covered by it. But because we're a healthcare provider, we have to abide by HIPAA. So there are certain uses and disclosures for the protected health information. The basic premise in terms of having an overall general rule as you're thinking about in your own day-to-day functions in terms of what you can do. Jersey Urology Group, and by default each of you as employees of the group, can't use or disclose the protected health information except as the way the HIPAA rules allow it. So the default is, from the government's perspective, don't do it unless we give you a reason for how to do it and a way for how to do it. The exception, you can share information, that protected health information, with another party if it's for one of four different purposes: treatment, and there's a specific definition for what's considered treatment; payment, there's a specific definition for what's considered payment; healthcare operations, which is sort of the functioning business activities; or if something is not otherwise explained, we actually have an authorization form that we've created that some of you have probably seen in your day-to-day job that allows certain information to be shared. So there are rules in place from the government's perspective about when you can share this information. Certain rules about how you can give it to family and friends. You have to make sure there are certain consents that have been provided. Any piece of information that you have that's considered protected health information, if somebody wants it, make sure it fits in one of the rules that we have in terms of how that information can be shared. And if you're not sure, again, ask somebody in terms of what needs to get done. There are other things that they've created in HIPAA, like if the New Jersey Department of Human Services would require Jersey Urology Group to provide certain information about influenza because they're concerned about an outbreak, there are things that the practice is allowed to do in sharing that type of information. So we'll make sure when that thing comes available to let you all know in terms of how best to handle it. If whenever there be a legal issue that comes in, there are requirements about how those patient information can be shared and in what venue it can be shared. So if you get a piece of mail and you open a piece of mail and you're not sure about it, they say this is a subpoena for certain information, ask one of the physicians or ask the privacy officer before you go and just affirmatively pull that file and start sending things off to somebody else. Or a patient calls on the telephone, or a patient says, I'd like to get my spouse's information or my parents' information. There are rules in place in terms of what we can give over and how we can give that information to people. There are certain rights. One of the things that HIPAA put together, there are certain individual rights that each of us have, whether we're an employee of Jersey Urology Group or a patient of the practice. There are certain rights that all of you have with respect to your health information in terms of where you want it to get sent, what manner it should be done, how timely it needs to get completed, and what it could cost in terms of getting that information. Now, some of the cost factors are changing as things are more and more electronic, because most places are away from the paper files where you got to copy 100 pages in the Xerox. You can now put something in a zip drive and get it in a secure way. But there are some charges that some of you might experience in your own personal health when you're going to get records transfer from one place to another. There are other individual rights in terms of some of your patients may, if they're clever or creative or have questions, they might ask for certain things that the practice needs to disclose in terms of how that's done. There's something that's called an accounting of disclosures. So if a patient wants to know how many times their information was disclosed over a certain period of time, they could ask for that information. And internally, we have systems in place that's tracking that. So if somebody would ever ask for that information, how it needs to get done. People might want to change their protected health information one way. There are very specific rules about what we allow a patient to do in terms of changing their own records because of medical liability issues, but there are certain areas where they can take activities. One of the things that we all do as part of our normal intake process with the kiosk is the Notice of Privacy Practices, where we tell the patients, this is the way Jersey Urology Group protects your protected health information. These are your responsibilities as an individual. These are our responsibilities as the group in terms of what we need to do. We have policies and procedures in place as well. A whole bunch of policies and procedures about HIPAA privacy. If you're not sure of something, again, it's going to sound like a broken record, talk to one of the doctors, talk to the privacy officer to make sure that you're doing the right thing. It's always better to take that extra step and make sure you're doing the right thing before you go affirmatively do it. I know everybody wants to be helpful and you're busy practicing, you have a lot of activities going on. Take that deep breath, pause, think about what you're doing, make sure it's compliant with the JUG policies as well as with the HIPAA policies overall. Ask questions if you're not sure. There's other administrative requirements that we have in place. You'll see that third bullet is the training. That's what we're doing today. It's very important to make sure to do that. There's processes in place if any patients would ever make a complaint, they think something was done inappropriately or they're not sure of something, there's a complaint process that we have built in terms of how things are handled. Sanctions. If somebody does something inappropriately, the practice needs to have the right to make sure that they can have the appropriate discipline against somebody if they didn't follow the rules that we have in place, because the rules are in place to protect each of you, to protect the practice, and to protect all of our patients in terms of what happens. So just know, like any of these things, if we violate the rules, there are consequences in terms of what can happen. One of the important things that we have to do is, if we think we've done something wrong, how do we fix it so it doesn't happen again? That's the whole purpose of mitigation. You know, shame on me once for making a mistake. I shouldn't make the same mistake twice if I can avoid it, and putting processes in place to make sure I can prevent that from occurring. One thing we can't do is we can't take retaliation against somebody. If somebody's alleging that something was done improperly, let's investigate it, let's fix it, but let's not shoot the messenger, if you will, in terms of what they have to done. So as an organization, we need to be very careful about protecting the integrity, the protected health information. And again, the policies and procedures in terms of what we have. So all of these things are internal things that we've created, that the practice has in place, so you know that we're HIPAA compliant in terms of what we're looking to do. Documentation, like everything you all do, very, very important. From the government's perspective, if you didn't write it, it didn't happen. And if you did write it, let's make sure it's written accurately and completely, because if it's inaccurate or incomplete, it's almost as bad as not doing it at all in terms of what you have. So the documentation is really, really important. That's what you do on an everyday basis. So let's shift for a minute. We were just talking about the privacy rule. The second rule I wanted to talk briefly about is the security rule. The HIPAA security rule deals with the electronic PHI, which 20-some years ago, it was less of an issue because many places were more and more paper, but they actually had the foresight to think about what do we do when the world becomes more electronic. So the security rule is a lot of things that Dr. Lehrfeld has to keep himself up at night thinking about and making sure that the practice is doing the right thing. There are three main buckets, if you will, under the security rule in terms of what Jersey Urology Group is doing to make sure that we maintain our compliance. They're what they call administrative safeguards, they're what they call physical safeguards, and then what they call technical safeguards in terms of how things are handled. So we do have an information security policy. Again, make sure you understand it's basic things like, should we be sending things unencrypted to somebody else? To when we get information, how do we open up and what do we do with it? How can we share it in what ways? But there is a policy in place to make sure you're aware of that. Under the security rule, again, those three different buckets, and this is going to get a little further into the weeds just for a few seconds. They've created rules where under the privacy rule, they were very proscriptive, if you will. They said, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. Under the security rule, they give a lot more latitude, because there's things that we as Jersey Urology Group may be able to do might be very different than what Atlantic Care can and should do in terms of the size of the institution and the resources they have in terms of the way they do things. So for each of these different safeguard standards, they've created what they call required specifications, which is very similar to what the privacy rule has. This is what you have to do. And they also have what they call addressable standards. So internally, Jersey Urology Group has made the assessment for these addressable standards, how we best address it. So we make sure we're maintaining compliance, but it's not a one-size-fits-all process in terms of what needs to get done. So they give a little bit of flexibility for these addressable specifications in terms of how they need to work. A couple of key standards just to think about in terms of what they are, and it's common sense, some of it, so I apologize if it seems like common sense, but you're all very busy, you're multitasking, doing lots of different things, trying to fit everything into the course of your day. Before you hit send, think about where you're sending something. Before you open something, before you open something, think about who is coming from. You know, those malware viruses that are now popping up all the time, very, very, thank you. Very, very dangerous for the practice in terms of what can happen. A couple of important rules. To the extent any of you do work at home, very specific rules about taking the PHI. Some of the worst examples that we have from scenarios are people who are actually trying to do the best thing. Somebody takes their laptop home, leave it in the car. Somebody breaks into the car and takes the laptop. It happens. The laptop's unencrypted information. Now, thousands of patients' information can go to whoever might have stolen that laptop out of the car. They probably weren't breaking into the car to take the PHI, but the PHI wasn't protected on the laptop. And how many of us can say, geez, I left my laptop in my car and I wasn't thinking twice about it. I went into the restaurant to grab dinner or whatever else, and my laptop and my briefcase and my purse were in the car. Somebody sees it, goes and takes it. Be very, very careful. There are rules in place about what things you can remove. Even on your phone, all of us have phones. PHI should not be on that phone unless it's encrypted and has the security in place that Jersey Urology Group needs. You lose your phone, somebody can access your phone, somebody hacks into the phone. We have to be very, very careful about that flow of information. So again, just use your best judgment in terms of thinking about those issues in terms of what needs to get done. Internally, we're doing these assessments. Todd is doing these assessments for the practice. There's a consultant who the practice has hired to make sure that we're doing the right thing in terms of getting things set up. Basic things, password management. Don't share your password. Don't put a sticky underneath your computer saying this is my password so anybody can show up and sort of see what it is. Keep it in your head or put it in the desk drawer, someplace where somebody's going to have to make a little bit of an attempt in terms of figuring out what's what. If you're sending emails as part of your job, make sure they're encrypted. Okay, it's not a requirement under the rule, but it's certainly a best practice in terms of doing that. Make sure it's encrypted. Make sure you know who you're sending it to. Back in the day, we would occasionally have issues not specific for Jersey Urology. Somebody sent something to the wrong fax number and the wrong information got in the wrong person's hand. Or there were 2 John Smiths and you sent it to the one John Smith and not the other John Smith, just because you're trying to do a lot of different things. So the encryption faction and then not putting the password in the encryption in that same email helps you mitigate that mistake. So the first email has the encrypted document. The second email said, here's the password to open up that document. So it's a little harder for somebody if you make a mistake in terms of pulling that information. There's something in the security rule for what they call security incidents. These things happen all the time, and you might read about these things in the newspaper where somebody got hacked or somebody tried to get hacked. I saw today there was an alert that Facebook apparently, who you think would be pretty sophisticated and secure, they said like 50 million of their accounts, somebody got into it and hacked information because it wasn't secure. So if it can happen to Facebook, it can happen to any of us because they're probably much further ahead of the curve than some of us in terms of our security. Just understand their rules. Be careful of the viruses. If you don't recognize, part of your job is getting emails from outside sources, you don't recognize the source, or there's a typo in the name, or it says dear sir or madam, when they're doing something, use some of your common sense in terms of what gets done. I know in my law firm, sometimes they send out emails purposefully to see if the attorneys who are running around doing lots of different things just click on and open and say, oh, there's a great new client opportunity. It's some crazy thing where they're trying to download information and pull that out of your system. So just like you do in your own personal life with your Yahoo or Gmail account, be careful with the things you do in Jersey Urology Group in terms of opening things and where you're sending things. The hackers aren't dumb. It's that old thing they used to say about, why do people rob banks? Because that's where the money is. That's the same reason why people try to hack into healthcare providers, because they think that's where the money is. Some large hospital systems have been held up for basically ransomware, where they say, we've accessed your information. If you don't pay X thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, we're going to release that information out to the general public. So they literally try to hold them hostage. So it can happen. We have protocols in place to try and prevent that. We can't be perfect. We can do our best, but we need your help to make sure that there's things that we're doing in terms of being accountable for those activities. Talk to Dr. Lehrfeld as the security officer if there are questions in terms of how these things get handled. Make sure that if you have a question, how it's best addressed in terms of what needs to get done. So third thing, so the first thing we talked about was the privacy rule. Second thing we talked about the security rule. The third thing I want to talk about is the breach notification rule. This is really important because more and more practices, if you ever read any healthcare periodicals or you see anything in the trade news, mistakes happen. These so-called breaches, they happen. There's a process in place and there's a protocol in place in terms of what we as Jersey Urology Group need to do in that regard, and what you need to do if you think there's been a breach. Don't hide it, don't cover it up, don't ignore it and hope it will go away. Let's proactively address the situation because we're on the clock. There's a time frame in terms of how soon we need to act in terms of doing something, in terms of what need to do. There are reporting obligations. Depending upon what happened and what the size of the breach was, in terms of how many patient information might have been inappropriately accessed or disclosed, there are disclosure requirements that may go into place. Depending on the size of it, on an annual basis, we need to let the federal government know how many breaches we've had. If it's a particular breach with a particular size, you might have to let the media know. You may have just seen in the newspaper a couple of weeks ago, Independence Blue Cross, the big blue plan out of Philadelphia, just announced, like, I think it was like 500,000 patients, their information had been accessed somehow because somebody stole a laptop and the information got out there. It happens. We don't want to get a black eye for ourselves, if you will, by having to disclose something when we could have been more proactive and thoughtful in terms of how best to protect our information, in terms of what we need to do. Again, if you suspect there's something wrong, talk to the privacy officer to make sure to get it done. So I thought, given that I'm a lawyer, I should at least give you the definition of what a breach is, so you understand what it is, because different people might think a breach is a different thing. So the definition's up there. An acquisition, access, use, or disclosure of the protected health information in a way that's not permitted. Good faith, unintentional things, there's always an excuse for that. Something was inadvertently done and the info was not further forwarded. I sent the email to the wrong person. As soon as I realized, I hit recall. There's no indication on the other side that they open up the email. An inadvertent disclosure, no harm, no foul in terms of what the rules, in terms of how it works. Or we can determine that the information couldn't have been retained. You know, for some reason it was sent, it automatically went to the trash file, it was never opened. You can do a forensic analysis to see what happened. So if something happens, we'd love to be able to prove the negative, but we might need your help in terms of how best to prove the negative. Unsecured PHI, as I said before, anything that's not encrypted is basically considered to be unsecured. So what do we do if there's a breach, in terms of how do we best try and fix it if something happens? As I said before, it's presumed to be a breach. If something goes wrong, we have to assume the worst. The glass is half empty. You know, for those of you who are the optimists, it's the opposite of what you want to hear. So we're going to assume the glass is half empty in terms of what happens. What we have to do, and where we would help Jersey Urology Group make sure to do this if there is a breach, is how do we demonstrate there's a low probability? Underline that important, because that's what the government's test is. There's a low probability that there was a compromise of that PHI based on the risk assessment that we would do. So we'd figure out who opened the email, when did they look at the email, was the email further sent, did we have an encryption on it in terms of what happened and how it was done. I recently helped a practice that was going through an issue where they called me up, not our practice, where somebody was going to speak at an event. They took a zip drive, put information onto their laptop. It was not encrypted. Laptop disappeared. It was at the conference, somebody picked it up and grabbed it. Who knows why, but somebody did it. Part of the analysis was actually going back to Microsoft and trying to figure out, was the default that it be encrypted unless you automatically say we're not going to encrypt it, and how was it done? Because from our perspective, wanted to make sure they could say there's a low probability that information was accessed. So if something goes wrong, the clock is ticking, so we need your help to give us as many key facts as possible so we can make sure we're doing the right thing. The burden's on us. We have to prove the negative in terms of saying, well, how there's the low probability that something didn't bad happen. As I said before, there's different notification requirements. If something happens, there's timelines, no later than 60 days. You might say 60 days, that's a long time. It's 2 months. Time flies by, because by the time somebody might have realized there's an issue, the time they tell us about the issue, the time to investigate the issue and do all the thorough feedback, we want to get to the point, ideally, of saying there's a low probability, but we can't make that up. We have to be able to document how we think, geez, there is a low probability that something bad might have happened. The disclosures, I said, always get to the federal government on an annual basis if we have something to disclose. If it's more than 500 individuals, it's going to go to the media. That's the last thing we want. You may say, oh, it's no big deal, it'll be a 1-paragraph story. We don't want negative publicity, because our patients count on us to do the right thing. We count on each other to make sure that we're doing the right thing, and we want to avoid those reputational risks. And the other bad thing is, when those breaches happen, where they say something happened, somebody stole a laptop, oftentimes what the federal government does as part of their investigation is they say that the practice or the hospital involved agrees to pay as a penalty or for their non-compliance, lots of money and lots of different more invasive training and oversight that they need to do following that. So there are real consequences, unfortunately, if something doesn't happen. So we always want to we're making sure that we're doing the right thing. So what do we do if there's a breach? because it's going to happen. It's inevitable in terms of a busy practice with multiple different locations and staff like you all who are working as hard as you can and handling as many different patient situations. Something could happen. If it does happen, what do? Make sure you know that we have a policy in place. If something happens that you think is a breach, ask one of the doctors, get the breach policy in terms of what it is. Coordinate with our privacy officer in terms of what gets done. Do it sooner rather than later. Again, don't say I'm going to wait for the weekend and I think it will go away and I can prove it on my own. We have resources internally in terms of helping because we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Like anything, because it's a government program, there are penalties. You can see how these penalties can add up pretty quickly in terms of what they look to do. And the curious thing is per violation, if you think about one medical chart, they could say that the one medical chart is one violation, or they could say that the 15 different identifiers on that one patient chart are 15 different violations. Because you had the person's first name, the person's last name, the person's address, the person's date of discharge, the date of the patient's care, the patient's insurance company. The fines can suddenly add up pretty quickly if one of these things would happen. It's the ultimate hammer that the federal government has to make sure that people maintain their accountability. So a couple of different examples in here. You can see how quickly these things add up. If you look at the first one rather, $400,000 because something was faxed to the patient's employer in terms of the patient's personal address. And if my memory is correct, this is somebody who might have had HIV or some other what they call super protected PHI. So it's something they certainly didn't want their employer to know about. That's an expensive fax, right? That's a really expensive fax. The second one, $2.5 million. Laptop was stolen from the vehicle I think it was at their house. Parked in their front driveway or at the curb. Somebody stole a laptop, they left it in the car, it had a lot of different protected health information on it, it was unencrypted. $2.5 million. That's a lot of protected health information that must have been on that laptop that was taken. PT provider, $25,000 because patient photos. One of the things that they have as part of the protected health information is any way that you can identify a patient. A lot of the cosmetic surgeons, the sort of before and after pictures, they need to make sure that the patient approves that in terms of what's getting done. These folks didn't. They paid $25,000 for a picture that was sitting out there. So some of you may have seen, it made it into some of the news, literally within the past couple of weeks, one of the television shows, a national network television show, must have filmed a bunch of different hospitals up in Boston with real patients. Between the three hospitals, they paid $1 million fine because they were disclosing PHI in an inappropriate way. You think this is Hollywood. These folks should know what the heck they're doing. Those hospitals got in trouble because of the way that PHI was exposed. So just be careful about it. It's really, really important because there are consequences that the practice will have to do and practice will have to handle. And we're a business like anything else, and we want to do the right thing. So a couple of last things to end with. I tried to get through this in a timely manner, but if folks have questions, just let me know. Because some of you, I know if you've been in the medical field for a while, you just take it for granted. It's just intuitive. If you're newer to the medical field, think before you do something. Take that extra step and think about, what am I doing? I want to be helpful to the doctor. Or I want to be helpful to the patient who calls. Make sure you're doing the right thing, complying with the policies. Critical, critical, critical. We have to protect our PHI. Okay, PHI in any form, it has to be protected, whether it's the old-fashioned paper records or a lab requisition, or it's the electronic files, making sure that those things are kept secure. If you're in a patient office, understand, don't leave information sitting up from the prior patient on the screen where somebody could see something in terms of how it can work. Follow our policies. The policies are in there for a reason. It's not because I like writing things. I do like writing things, but I like writing things that actually protect you all in terms of what you need to do. The policies get updated from time to time. If there's a new issue, a new development, a new problem that we've spotted or identified, we proactively try and address those things. So make sure you know how the policies are changed. Again, the most important thing that I've said a couple of different times, if you see a problem, let one of the doctors know, let the privacy officer know. Don't sweep it under the rug, think it's no big deal, nobody's ever going to find out. We'd rather you address it and let us know about it so we can fix it. And if it's something that we're doing incorrectly or we can do better, we want to use it as a teaching moment so we can improve everything for the practice in terms of what we need to do. because you're all busy, you're doing the best you can to care for patients who have lots of different circumstances. Some of them might be older, some of them may not understand things, some of them might have a daughter or a son come in to help them out with things. Just know there are rules in place in terms of how we can best share that PHI. So with that, I'll stop. Unless there are questions that anybody has or scenarios that they confront. Yeah,
I
Frank.
just want to make a comment here.
Yeah, please.
First things first, you guys are like ninjas in terms of like how you handle HIPAA, in my opinion. You guys are outstanding. You guys all know to look for the HIPAA forms. You guys all know that you can't get that information. With that said, let me give a couple more best practices. Number one, the biggest thing that we see is when inappropriate lab or appointment sheets get given to the wrong person. So a best practice is always to look at the document and say, Mr. Jones, you're Mr. Jones. Don't just give them the first sheet on the printer, because that's, of all the things we have to investigate every year, that's the number one thing. Number two, if you've got a Jug cell phone or Jug laptop, fortunately no PHI lives on the laptops because we have no information, everything's remoted in. But if you lose either one of those things, please notify us immediately so we can wipe it remotely. And then we can document that we wiped it remotely so there's a low probability. On your cell phone, if you get a text that has PHI encrypted, still delete that PHI from your cell phone, just in case. This way it doesn't stay there forever.
Yeah, absolutely. Any questions at all? We have another 6 or 7 hours to kill. Well, thank you. It's worthwhile. Periodically, we're going to do this. If something new comes out, I always send something off to the practice so they're aware of it. They will make sure to let you know about it. For your friends who are working in other practices, I'm sure they periodically have to do this as well so they understand it. It's not going to go away. As long as we have electronic records, it's going to stay and it's going to become more of a prevalent issue. And I don't want us to ever become an example of something, geez, that we wish we should have done something better or differently because we were trying to do the right thing and trying to be a ninja, as Frank had said, in terms of thinking about how best to serve the patient needs. Just take that extra deep breath, make sure we're going about it in the right way, and then nothing you need to worry about, because at some point it's going to become second or third nature for you, just in terms of you know the way to handle things, you know what the patients might be asking for, you know what you can and can't do, and if you don't know what you can and can't do, go turn to the right person to make sure you do it. Yeah.
Is the cleaning crew included under Jug?
I'm sorry?
The cleaning crew at night.
Is it what?
The cleaning crew.
The cleaning crew? No, they're not covered by what we need to do, because their job is not, I mean, obviously clear your desk at the end of the day,
Well,
turn
that's my
things over
question,
if you
turn
can.
over papers.
But they've
Yeah.
signed a BAA though. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, if they have, but I mean, their job as the cleaning person is not to help out with the administration of the medical practice. So, I mean, it's not part of their job functions to do that in terms of what they need to do. So just keep your desk clean, keep your desk neat in terms of what it is. Same way as you have patients coming back and forth, you know, in one room and out the other, clear out the room before the next patient comes in so the information's not laying around so we don't have an inadvertent thing, because that's on us in terms of doing that.
And anybody who goes in the back that doesn't have Jug Paycheck should have a signed BAA, and if you're not sure, check with Melody. If they don't have a signed business associates agreement, they can't go in back when patients are here.
Right, we just want to be really careful about who's getting exposed to the PHI. All right, guys, happy Friday.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for putting up with us today with all the information.